Welcome everyone. Thanks for joining the deep dive session on conformance. So I hope you all know what we're talking about here, because it is going to be a bit of a deep dive. We did an intro talk on Wednesday, which apparently should be online already, or any day now. So in this deep dive session, we're actually going to be going into the weeds, and we're going to be talking about testing and improving our testing, looking at our coverage, and all the goodness that kind of creates the conformance suite that as we know it. And without further ado, let me hand it over to Hippie Hacker.
Hello, I'm Hippie Hacker, and Rowan and I came over from New Zealand to talk about API Snoop. API Snoop is a collection of log analysis tools and ways to collect logs for our KPICs. KPICs are our Kubernetes API consumers. We have some approaches based on kubeadmin that we did some improvements on, and we'll share a little bit about that. So Kubernetes API consumers, or KPICs, we want to focus on looking at what our APIs or what our applications are using in the field so that we know what's important for us to test. First, how do we get access to these logs? We tried some different approaches. We started off with some man-in-the-middle approaches, sidecarring things in IP tables and redirecting through. Looked at using Envoy or Istio, but it was a bit complex. So we looked into webhooks as well. We added support for Kubernetes kubeadmin so that you can deploy your API servers with all the correct parameters to enable the audit policy and to add a webhook destination so that as every API flows through the API server, we can collect it without needing to be on the API server itself. We worked on some workarounds for Minikube and kops that weren't let complete. In the future, we may be able to use the cluster API to reconfigure our API servers to have the information it needs to send webhooks for our audit information. So how do we enable our API snooping? We decided for now to use our audit logs directly on the master API server. So our approach today requires that you have access to configure your master and enable audit and be able to retrieve those logs. So now, how do we retrieve our logs while the KPIC is running? Later on, we'll be able to do this via webhook. Again, this approach does not work on managed API servers like GKE. It will allow centralized aggregation, so we can inform everyone of this beautiful collection of all of our logs so that we can do some centralized analysis as well, or CAPI analysis as a service. We'll see how well that pulls off. So for now, again, we're looking at audit log retrieval via SSH and tail, and we're just SSHing the master to retrieve those logs. Looks something like this. Find your API server container and follow the logs and output them to your local file. Any questions? The output looks like this. It's a raw JSON. Lots of data, but it's nice because we can know everything about the parameters going into the functions that we're calling via the API, and the output, and the time, and the pod, and it's really useful information. So now we've got these great, wonderful snoops on our API. What can we do with that information? And that's where our analysis tools that we're prototyping and putting through into this repo are starting. We have a log review that can load audit files, and those are those raw logs that come from the API server. We're just tailing them and putting into a file and loading them up into an SQLite DB. The remaining commands access that DB and output them to various CSV files. We have one that we imported, the Google Sheets document that was there prior with all the information on what's currently being audited or being tested for conformance. We have another one for all of the charts. Each of the charts that we tested, we basically went through quite a few of the stable Helm charts, spun them up. We looked for ones that had RBAC, because we knew if they had RBAC, they're going to be CAPICs and not just an application running on Kubernetes. We also had some usage sheets and some summaries that I'll show you as we progress through the slides. This is a real simple summary of from those prior commands where the CSV is there. And you can see we have some applications that the highest thing they use is beta, and one of them is using some alpha stuff. I think that's the Sonobui test. So we all know about the Kubernetes Conformance, and that's where we're using our Sonobui data to upload it to the repo and create a PR and say, I'd like to put on my website the certified Kubernetes logo that says my company is supported for this version. But what I'd suggest is we should prioritize the untested endpoints by what our community is using. And we might look at not just having conformance for our Kubernetes instances, but for our Kubernetes KPICs or Kubernetes applications. Again, we're going to have this information. We're analyzing it via API Snoop, and we can tell whether a KPIC is stable, beta, or alpha, and that'll allow us to know whether it's going to work on the next release for sure or not. Might be we do something similar to what we do with the Kubernetes Conformance. Use API Snoop in a way similar to Sonobui to collect the information for that application and certify it for one version if it's stable, or one version if it's alpha and beta, and the version and the next version if it's 100% stable. Possibly something like this, where we have our applications and we know that this one's beta, it's only good for this release.
I think you would need the version number.
We just didn't get around to adding the version number. This was just moments ago, and we came up with this, this approach. So we have all this data now, and we have it for each of our applications. And it's not just the metrics on which API call we used, but all the parameters and the responses for that. If we look at the containers and the images we pull in, it might be possible to go through and find the source code for those applications and link the particular call to our data that's making the call so that we can do some, just say, interesting things that we don't know yet. This is a graph of Scaffold. If you go to apisnoop.ia.coop, you can click on the apps and check out, or click on this link within the slide deck. It shows that we have a certain percentage of stable and a certain percentage of beta, and within those, all of the API groups within Kubernetes.
What's each circle?
So the center will only be 3 at most. The green is stable. The blue is beta, and the red is alpha. And on the outer ring of those are all the different API groupings that are used within that. Sure.
Just to help for context for the audience.
Yes.
Standard model we had for conformance was you ran a tool called Sonobui, it generated a report, and here if you pass, you made conformance or not, you said hooray. You're now talking about a different tool, and if you could provide some context of how that relates to the typical world that we were all used to.
Sure.
Even I'm having a little trouble understanding how this fits into the world of conformance. I know it's doing some cool stuff telling you what APIs are, but could you give a little background to help us understand
Sure.
why we're talking
There's 2 things I wanted to highlight here. One is we have the Kubernetes Conformance with its we passed and we're good, and the concept of possibly having Kubernetes KPIC certifications, conformance. And if it's solid on that version or stable, then you know that it's going to work on the next release.
KPIC meaning application. So this would be a totally separate certification program, a parallel certification program, which we're not on board yet. We're not launching it.
It's
like
an idea.
Initial look at it.
Okay. Just
Actually,
trying to get some context.
Yeah, do you mind?
No, go for it.
One more, and sorry, I probably should have given the context. I did ask Chris to do this work, so I'm if you're unhappy with it, you should blame me, not him. But most certification programs tend to certify both sides, both the platform and the application that's running on it. One of the pieces of really initial feedback that I'd love to get is that I'm under the assumption that there's not a lot of interest in certifying applications in the sense of, I want to run WordPress and MySQL on my Kubernetes cluster. Everybody agrees if you containerize that and write some YAML, it should run on a certified Kubernetes cluster. So there's nothing that should be certified there. So what we wanted to do is get across this idea of, oh, but there are a set of tools that are interacting with the Kubernetes API in a more sophisticated way. And so Scaffold, Draft, Brigade, KSonnet, Istio, and those are all open source, but there's also a bunch of closed source ones like an Aqua or a Twistlock on the security side that, at least in principle, any of those tools should ideally run on any certified Kubernetes. So we just invented this term yesterday afternoon, and that you could talk me out of, which is a Kubernetes API consumer. Yeah, but let's do this.
I was just going to ask a question, because are you measuring the APIs that are being used for what purpose? What, just out of interest to see who's using what, or are you going to use it to get to some kind of checklist or something at some point? And then the other question I have is, while you said we're not going to do conformance testing of applications, what I do think would be cool is if, as an application writer, I could use your tool here to find out which APIs I'm using that are outside the scope of the conformance test suite. And that will tell me whether, because, well, if they're all within the conformance test suite, then I should be guaranteed that it's portable. But if they're outside the conformance test suite, then I know these APIs may not work everywhere, and I may want to look at perhaps some alternatives that are within the conformance test suite. So that might be very useful for application writers.
Right, except that like a real application writer isn't thinking about Kubernetes at all. They just wrote some Python and it's in a container. And so, well, no, I understand, but that was the distinction. We didn't do it. We definitely were missing two intro slides here that I apologize for. But we're making this distinction, it may be overly artificial, between just an application, which is just a container, and something that's exercising the Kubernetes API. And anything that's exercising the Kubernetes API is something that you would run this tool on and make sure, hey, am I only using conformant APIs that are available? The one other piece that I'll just add in, and then I'll get off the stage, is the other sense of this tool is, even if we never go forward with a parallel certification program, we thought it would be very useful to look at real tools. What APIs are they exercising today that we don't have conformance tests for? And as we work with Globant and look to prioritize those, that it would be nice to prioritize the important ones that don't have coverage yet.
Thanks for that, Dan. Thanks for all the clarifications. This next is a prioritized list of the times that Scaffold used these APIs. They are untested. I think the Scaffold team would probably really be happy if these were in conformance. KSonnet uses less APIs. You can see that it is pretty beta, though. The APIs that are stable, and I put one beta in there, these are the ones that the KSonnet team would be really interested in getting into the conformance suite. Draft was another one we looked at. It's about 50-50. Uses a lot of app area. And here's its prioritized list of what's important to them. This is the Sonobui. You'll notice the big gray portions there. That's what we're missing. This is the, from our perspective, we have a little different results than Umichi. And we'll figure out why those are different at some point later. There's the whole list for all of our applications. This is the prioritized list for all the applications together. So secrets, service, config map, services, pods, those are all things that we need to prioritize.
Good question. How do you know that a particular tool actually uses only those APIs? Because you're probably running some tests, but maybe you're not testing everything. You can't cover it.
Yes. And we need to try to drive those tests harder, and I think that's what this slide says. I need to figure out how to get Helm test or a project-specific ED test to do everything that application needs to do with the API. This allows us to do some analysis of their patterns. Does that answer your question?
Well, I guess in some ways, I feel like if people want to try a tool and I want to make sure that it's compliant, I should provide a series of tests, but I should also provide some kind of white box analysis that you can see that I'm not hiding some tests.
This is the external analysis we captured at the API level. So if you can get the application to do everything it's supposed to do, we'll be able to know what that output is. That's it. If you want to look at some of these slides, APISnoop.i.coop has links to visuals. Then when you move your mouse over, you can see the different statistics on that, including the Excel spreadsheet that's been updated to have all of these applications, whether they're using that API or not. And I'll hand it over. Yep.
That's very cool. So
Thank you.
Earlier you talked about not just the paths, but possible parameters being impacting.
Yes.
Did I miss it? Did you have any ideas of how you were going to display or track or measure or whatever those?
There's several ideas that I have that we haven't fleshed out yet around looking for patterns with all of the applications as they flow. So it's the data-driven use of the API. So it's not just this API. There'll be the things that start, and there's going to be constant flows. And those are probably the user stories we need to do. We need to test within our E2E test and conformance suites. But that's going to take looking. Thank you.
So we'll follow up on the mailing list and on a telephone, video conference call.
Thank you. All right, so next up to talk about that huge area of gray mass that we need to fill in is Aish and Mithra.
Thanks, guys. Quick show of hands. How many of you were in the intro on Wednesday? Okay, that leaves like a lot of people who are in there. So I'm quickly going to go over the overview and then and then we'll do a deep dive into the SIG testing efforts that we are doing here. Okay. So as of today, we have 55 certified Kubernetes partners. This is great because there's a lot of participation in the community, but it also comes with its own set of challenges, which is specifically how do we deliver on the goals of portability and consistency. Especially portability is the assurance that customers can lift and shift their workloads between different cloud providers, and consistency, when they do that, they are aware of what it entails to migrate their workloads and get up and running on, say, even on-prem or cloud clusters as well. And we also provide upgrade assurances, especially if a cloud provider is certified for a version of Kubernetes, then the customer can, with considerable degree of confidence, expect to get up and running once they upgrade their clusters to the new versions. Towards this, about a year back, CNCF and the Kubernetes community, they started the Software Conformance Certification Program. What it is it's a quality gate for cloud providers to become Kubernetes certified. So basically, it's we have a conformance test suite, which have a set of golden end-to-end test cases, which if the cloud provider passes, then the customers can be quite confident that they provide the goals of consistency, portability, and support all the features that come with that version of Kubernetes. It was launched with version 1.8 with 32 platforms. And as for the certification policy itself, the providers need to get certified for each release of Kubernetes, especially running the tests that come with that version. And they also need to renew their certification every year to ensure that they stay conformant. Quick overview, the program itself is run by the community for the community under the aegis of CNCF. And we have 3 SIGs that work closely with it, mainly the SIG architecture, which defines what tests go into the conformance suite itself, and SIG testing, which dictates or which kind of works on the mechanics of the test, how to run the test, what test infra to use. And then we have the conformance working group, which has representatives from all the different SIGs and the community itself, who are passionate about driving the policy and the process around the program. Digging a little deeper in there, the charter of the conformance working group itself has 2 missions, mainly to define the process around the certification program and also improve the test coverage, the gray area that we just saw. In terms of process, there are quite a few things that fall under this bullet. Mainly, we are working on formulating and drafting a formal specification for documenting these test cases, like adding some metadata around like providing description for the tests and releases, defining long-term sustainability, like what API should be go into the conformance suite when, coming up with some beta test suite, and also the concept of profiles. If you need more info on this, we can always discuss it offline in the interest of time. And we also have some tooling around publicly publishing these results. and working closely with SIG testing, as I said, to drive and adopt reliable tooling, and proactively reaching out to providers to get them certified. And again, the reason for doing, and the second mission is to increase the conformance test coverage itself. Right now, these are our coverage numbers. In V110, we only have about 18% of the stable API covered. While this is a good trend, still the baseline is pretty low, and we want to get it, we want to drive the coverage number high to be able to confidently certify any provider. And our goal is to increase this coverage by 40% in Q3, and for the top 3 APIs that will be identified using API Snoop or other API coverage tools, we want to drive that coverage to 80%. And Mitra would talk about how we plan to do this.
So these are basically some best practices for adding new conformance tests. Basically communication. You have to join the weekly working group meetings and the Slack channel. And basically also the SIG testing has weekly meetings and Slack channels as well. And how to increase coverage, basically prioritizing API endpoints, which Hippie Hacker went over, and that was a really good overview of how to prioritize. And we are working with a contracted engineering group from Globant, who are vendors who are actually actively working on writing these tests right now. And enlisting SIG participation, both for reviewing these tests as well as approving all the changes. The Globant vendors are working on these changes, and we'd love for people to step up in the community to start reviewing their PRs. And some guidelines on how to write tests. So I'm going a little faster in the interest of time, but basically working with the SIGs to identify all the test gaps, and then figure out what tests to be added to the conformance test suite. Sometimes there may be existing tests that would be a conformance test, but we are simply not aware or have not added it to the suite. And review the end-to-end test scenarios to add, and we should be doing the test by user journey. And using conformance it instead of the Ginkgo it label to describe the tests. Adding a very less flaky or non-flaky test to the suite is ideal. And verifying that they pass on multi-node clusters as well as single-node clusters, especially for networking. Yes?
Yeah, I didn't see a bullet there for the annotations that describe the test. Are the
Yes.
folks expected to add that, or is that added in later like we did the first round? What is going to be the best practice for making sure they're properly annotated?
I think we would like it for folks to start adding it as they write the test as well right now, and not add it in retrospect as we did for the first round.
Yeah, I'd make it a requirement.
Yes.
Ask them to do it later, they'll quote forget.
Exactly. And yeah, likewise for the PRs, when they come in, also versioning them with the release number, those should all be requirements going forward and not post requirements. And yes. Yes. And SIG architecture will be reviewing and approving the PRs, but these are the things that they will be looking for. And 2 week is the SLA for reviewals. And where to focus, basically, these are some overall guidelines for where to focus attention. The key APIs are very important, but focusing on behaviors that are likely to be swapped out, focusing on pod feature testing and the open API spec. Deep dives are needed for certain SIGs and certain applications as well. And making sure we test etcd at a holistic level, at the API level, and not internal implementation details. Tests shouldn't be hitting etcd directly. We have a lot more best practices and things to focus on. I have a document that I can share out more widely, so people know where to focus their attention when they're writing these tests. And we also have been developing more of a Hermetic Conformance testing tool with Docker and Docker. There are some caveats. It does not work with multi-node networking, but then for a lot of conformance tests, this should provide a way to be able to run these tests extremely quickly and write conformance tests that are not flaky. And virtualizing the cluster on one machine is what we're doing. And it can be easily torn down because it's Docker and Docker. When you tear down the master Docker, then all of it gets destroyed. Many swappable components can be tested. And these are some of the limitations of Docker and Docker. We don't expect it to be the test-all solution, but for a large case of tests, this might make it extremely faster. So I'll give it to Aish to talk about reporting test results.
So I touched upon this point briefly. one of the things that the Conformance Working Group is looking at is to provide an easy way for providers to contribute their test run results for it to be published in a public space where everybody has visibility to it. There are multiple reasons to it. The way the conformance program works right now is the providers run the test on their own and they submit the artifacts for review and certification by CNCF. While this works, it doesn't, there's no way for us to verify that the providers did run it or they ran it on the right version unless the users can run the test on their own. Publishing it to a common place kind of raises awareness at two levels. One, the providers themselves can be alerted to early signals of when a test fails. And number two, if there's some other regression elsewhere, we can know the impact and the scope of which providers it affects. So right now the TestGrid is the chosen tool for dashboarding and monitoring these results. This is not something new for those who are familiar with testing in the open source world. TestGrid has been the monitoring and reporting tool for hundreds of end-to-end tests that are run both in pre-submits and CI pipeline currently. So in the last couple of months, SIG Testing developed an upload tool, which basically consumes the artifacts that come out of the conformance test or end-to-end test, and it uploads it parses it and uploads it in a format from which TestGrid can pull the results and display it. So this tool is super easy to use, both manually and to be plugged into the provider's CI pipeline. And it integrates well with existing conformance tools, like any test, if your test trigger is KubeTest or Sonoboy, it integrates well with both. And here's a quick overview of how it works. So there are multiple cloud providers. They trigger end-to-end tests using the CI job ideally. And the end-to-end tests run on their K8s cluster. It takes the test from the version of the K8s build they're trying to certify. And the test produces the E2E logs on the JUnit. The tool then consumes these inputs and provides basically a couple of output files, the timestamp.json, like start and the stop time, and the run result, the overall success, and then pushes it to GCS buckets specific to that particular cloud provider. And then for each provider, they provision themselves in TestGrid with a dashboard, and the specific dashboard gets access to the appropriate GCS bucket from which TestGrid is able to pull the results on a periodic basis as and when they're available. So this is the current conformance dashboard. So as you can see, we have other SIG end-to-end tests being published there as well. So we have a specific tab for conformance, and if you can see, we have all the conformance results under that. So currently we have Openstack as one of the provider who is been contributing results to us on a regular basis. So yeah, we have different versions of tests that we run for them, and we can see that we are able to monitor their conformance pretty closely. I'll hand it over to Christy for some new framework that she's. Yeah.
So we've always been very careful that the people who do the testing want to have the control over when they upload. So I assume they still have control that they go to text and they send it out and it looks like they will pass half a test even though they don't have to. So they get to control when they choose to upload.
Yeah, this even be completely, always fight to their CI pipeline. They can manually upload it whenever they have to. But this is the way where we can monitor to see if they actually, if they are applying for certification, have they actually done the test. And also, eventually, if it is plugged onto a CI pipeline, then periodically we can say, are they staying conformance?
So we have to pick up the phone and say, hey, we noticed you haven't sent the results.
So different goal for this part of the project. Continuous iteration.
I just want to mention there are only 3 minutes left.
Every event we upload results from GCP and Openstack is going to say they go. That's an optional part of the program.
Maybe we can continue this particular discussion just afterward. Okay. Okay, cool. This is going to be really brief. I'm Christy. I'm a software engineer at Google, and I want to talk about the potential for a new conformance test framework. So if you take a look at the existing conformance test framework, this is where it lives. And so I took a look at it, and the number of commits that were in that directory is nearly 1,500. And those 1,500 commits came from 185 different people. And then if you start looking at the email addresses that they used, there are 33 different domains. So that's not necessarily 33 different companies, but it actually might even be more because Gmail, like who knows what companies those people came from. So What we're saying is that the end-to-end framework has grown organically over nearly 1,500 commits by nearly 200 people at potentially more than 20 different companies, which I think raises some interesting questions like, how do you maintain things like quality, consistency, and standards over that many contributions? I think within one company, it's hard to do that. So how did we do that with the test framework? Also, I think an easy answer to that is, well, the reviewer is going to enforce those things, but that many commits, that many pull requests, I think it's probably too much to expect the reviewers to be focusing on the particular standards of the conformance test framework. So the next question is Ginkgo. So if you're familiar with these end-to-end tests at all, you'll know that they were built with Ginkgo. And after looking into it, we've come to the conclusion that Ginkgo is the best BDD framework in Go. But then we have to ask, do we really want to be using BDD? When we have all of these contributors coming in, do we want them to have to learn all of the best practices for BDD in order to contribute? So we think it's time to revisit this framework and prefer a few things. We want Go style in our tests. We want contributors to be able to ramp up quickly. We want to be able to debug failures quickly, and we want to take advantage of the Hermetic test environment that was just mentioned. And another thing, I think the community is hungry for an end-to-end testing framework that they can use for other Kubernetes-based testing. So in conclusion, I think that it's time that we take a look at having a new framework, and that'll mean better contributions, and it'll mean we have more contributors. And that is it for that. I will have a proposal. Yeah.
And all these Ginkgo-based tests.
Yeah.
And my guess is you're going to get a lot of people pushing back and saying, hey, wait a minute, let's not throw what out we've done.
Oh, yeah.
Contributions. Let's see how we can improve the framework we have.
Mm-hmm.
I think you might want to be very careful. I don't know who those folks are that put all that investment into those tests, but when you walk in and you say, well, we should start over, expect folks to come in and say, hey, wait a minute, there's a lot of reasons there's these things in Ginkgo, there's a lot of reasons why they're there.
Yeah.
And please make sure you understand why they're there and why we're using them, unless you have an alternative that demonstrates where you're going to prove the value. I would say I would be very careful how you phrase that when you go to a community folks that have been working in space for quite a while. I'm not one of those folks. I'm just saying that's what I would expect.
Oh yeah, I totally agree. So I would say this is more of this is like the beginnings of a proposal and not something that we're necessarily going with. So I don't know if anyone wants to say anything about the roadmap. I think we're actually out of time at this point though, so yeah.
This is just a rundown of everything we talked about. Basically, for coverage, we need an approved way to measure coverage and get the coverage up to 80% by end of year. For frameworks, discuss and then figure out an approved conformance test framework with the community, which may be Ginkgo at the end of the year, but at least get it all approved. And then hermetic testing via Docker and Docker for certain classes of tests. And kubetest becomes one of the de facto ways to run conformance tests, not to say that Sonobuoy won't be. And for result displays, like results published to all providers via the dashboard and standardizing on that, and documented process and best practices for writing all these tests and procedures to onboard providers to be conformant. And these are all some, if we achieve all of this by end of year, then we should have a really good story with conformance. Yeah.
So just again, just not seen this before. Kubetest becomes the de facto way to run conformance tests. Is there a particular reason why Sonobuoy, who I again don't work on, but did not suffice? I'm just trying to understand the need to make that the de facto thing.
So yeah, actually, like I was saying, it should be kubetest / Sonobuoy, not necessarily like kubetest becoming the one way to run conformance tests. Yeah. A supported way would have been an ideal way or a better way to frame that. Yes. Yes, definitely. Yes, I agree. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, everyone. If anyone's interested, that was a huge amount of content and absolutely amazing. Just love seeing all the work everyone's doing in this. If people have time, let's just continue the conversation outside the room. And the next call is, I think, in 3 weeks. So should be a lot to discuss then. Thanks, everyone.